Video economics, I believe. So just gonna throw it on this channel. So this is the capacitor that's bulged on the motherboard. And you can see the little top there is kind of corrupted. Yes. So it did explode. Anyway, I think I will try replacing it. Yeah, I think I will. That's what I think I'll do. So anyway, put this on the other setting. Yeah, that should work. It mustn't go all the way down. Anyway, oh no, that's right, I'm going to do a drawing video, so I don't need to go there. But anyway, yeah, so there's a couple of modern mystic, we did a post on his website. I just thought I would respond to it with some description of the an overview of how the economy works, kind of thing. So it's sorry, I've got to see where the switches are and whether it's still recording. Yeah, this is the way you do it. Yeah, okay, now I can see what I'm doing. Yeah. All right. Anyway, sort of better. Mostly. So anyway, yeah. So there was a couple of. I'll just point to the picture of the website, post a link. These two videos, and so it's all British crap, but they're like simple outlines of how banking works and the fractional reserve thing, which I've tried to explain, and the fiat currency thing, and what else is there to say? That it isn't really just a way of using currency to generate other IOUs, other forms of IOU. And so it's just sort of deceptive that it's all cash. It's all claims on something called cash. But cash itself is claims on something called value. And that's really what you're talking about, value or stuff. I mean, theoretically, let's say you had a note from the government that was just the same as cash, except it was just written different. But it was signed and just said $30 worth. And you had this expectation of $30 worth. They can give you $30 worth of anything, theoretically, and that would be the correct thing to do. So if they did happen to have a whole bunch of gold, the government, if you went to the bank and said, I want my money, they could give you gold, and that would be a fair exchange. The gold is valued at the same amount as the money, so it really wouldn't matter if they gave you the money or some kind of money, as long as the value was the same. Like, let's say, for example, there's been a period where Canadian dollar and the American dollar were about equal. I mean, if they gave you Canadian dollars, who cares? It's the value that you put in the bank, kind of a thing. So it's really not about the paper. The thing about the paper is, though, is if you make a whole bunch of it into the economy, it will create it will deflate the value of that paper relative to other paper, and so then it won't be as valuable as a Canadian dollar, because it won't be as a claim on as much value. It will be diluted, and the dilution has a real effect. So anyway, yeah, so I think I'll just go through it and point out the obvious stuff. Because there are things that people just aren't, and it's really so hard to predict when this whole thing's going to come crashing down. And so understanding some of the mechanisms of it can't hurt. I was just kind of stunned by the FDIC number when I went to go look for that. You can't get a really hard number, but what's obvious is, the government has federally insured deposits for the value of cash, and theoretically they're way overextended in terms of they don't have the money to do that with. If there's any real crisis, there's a big flood, they're not going to have the stuff in the account to cover the expenditure. The insurance isn't going to make it. It's going to have to print cash, and in printing cash, it'll devalue cash. So regardless of where the cash is, it's in your pocket cash or cash in the bank, all of it gets devalued. When you devalue any of it, you devalue all of it. So, if you only give depositors you know, if you give them printed cash instead of real cash, you automatically screw all the people that have real cash in their pocket. Automatically. Anyway. Yeah, oh, that's macro. Okay. No, that's the other one. All right, that's just the one I want. So I switch around now. Yeah, it's a little messy. A little sloppy, but who cares? It's a video. So, it might even be the right size for what I'm going to draw, right? Alright, anyway. So, I've done this Federal Reserve thing before, but let's just make it simple. So, we just go by vaults. So, we could say the Federal Reserve has a vault, and then we could say the banks have a vault. But let's just consider the banks just all one thing. And let's just combine all their vaults into one vault, because in essence that's what it all is, you know. And so, you know, because if somebody borrows money from one bank and deposits it in another bank, it's a net zero. So, you know, to the overall system, to the overall dollar. So it's irrelevant in a way in terms of measuring how much there are in reserves. And in a way this is, you know, it just feels a little too redundant, but we have to get to this redundant part to get to the part I guess I want to get to, which is going to get back to the stuff argument, the value. You know, what's the real value, you know? And I argue the real value is stuff, and this whole system just exists to make stuff tradable. And so the easiest way to make stuff tradable is to convert stuff into money, into bills. And so largely that's what happens through deeds. You know. Now they go into these banks first. So deeds go into banks, and money comes out, cash comes out, and then cash goes back in as deposits, right? So this you could sort of understand that if you need stuff to be monetized because you're going to use the value of it, it's extra. So this again is surplus, stuff you're not living in or stuff you're not using, like even your house, you're not using it per se. You don't want to lose it in a loan, but you might as well get the value of it if you want to buy some stocks or something. So that's sort of the example I'll use. So stuff has deeds. The deeds go into the bank. The bank produces cash to you. The cash ends up in a deposit because, and even if you buy something, okay, so you buy, it's still the business will have a deposit account, no doubt. So it'll always end up being redeposited in a bank one way or another. I mean, it all ends up back in the bank as a deposit of some kind. So the amount of cash out and the amount of deposits in, now that's the tricky part. You know, in a year, this number might be the same. So there might be the same amount of cash goes out as new deposits come in 1 year. But the deposits over time accrue, so they get larger, while this number of how many loans go out stays the same. So the new deposits put on the pile of deposits get smaller. The new deposit, yeah, it is smaller, but the accruing pile of deposits, the actual number of deposits, is large. So, for example, in Britain, by one of these charts they had, the deposits, the amount of cash in the economy is only like 3% of the amount of deposits. So the actual dollars is very small compared to the number of claims on cash as deposits. And certainly in our system it's likewise a huge ratio, and even if the insured deposits. So in our system, you have 7 trillion, say, of deposits, and only 30 billion of a reservoir to pay those 7 trillion in claims. So that's FDIC insurance. So we have $7 trillion of accrued deposits and only $30 billion insuring those. And then that doesn't count the deposits that are uninsured, which are largely the deposits of the very rich, or deposits in some way directly related to uncollateralized or low collateralized loaning. You know, deposits that are in a risk category, where they're receiving interest not commensurate with collateralized loans, but commensurate with uncollateralized loans. So brokerage houses and stuff wouldn't count as the same kind of deposit. So anyway, another gimmick of this whole thing. Well, here, so how does the cash, this, that comes out, get out? And people think it just flies out straight through the Federal Reserve and somehow never gets reconsumed by the Federal Reserve, that there's always cash going out. So there's only in the economy $1 trillion of this cash, 1.2 trillion in all of the world of actual cash. But there's maybe, you know, like I said, there's at least 7 or 8 or 9 trillion just in deposits. But the deposits aren't cash deposits. They're banknote deposits. The bank gives you a receipt. You come in, give them your cash. They give you a receipt that says I owe you. So they're IOU deposits. They're not cash deposits anymore. And that's why you receive interest on them. Obviously, cash doesn't create interest. So the deposit creates interest because the cash gets reused. And the way it's recycled basically is the cash that comes in. When the bank gets actual cash in, it often goes back to the Federal Reserve as damaged or used. Like the average dollar bill only has a lifespan of 3 years. And when the Federal Reserve cleans it, it puts the new money as reserve digits in the reserve accounts, and in this process rebalances the books. So if some institution took cash from the Federal Reserve, then they pay back the cash they took from the Federal Reserve. So if they used new cash to make a loan, that wasn't their cash, so they had to use it from a Federal Reserve account. So the reserve accounts hold the bank's deposits. It's their money. And the way their money gets back into the reserve account is through the cleaning process. But in the cleaning process, the account is rebalanced, in the sense that if the bank used reserve cash, the money goes back into the reserve account. So now it's not cash again. So you can sort of see that it sort of got eaten up. It got reconsumed back into a digit in a vault, not cash in a vault. So that's how the cash is maintained at this low level, is that it's reconverted into a reserve digit that only becomes, in the end, a banker's IOU deposit. So this piece of cash here that went in gets turned back into a reserve digit. It gets turned back into electronic money. And then it goes out again and gets re-electronicized. But I'm just saying the real hard cash is controllable by the Federal Reserve through this process. By increasing or decreasing the reserve minimums of the banks, they could increase or decrease how much actual cash was in circulation, as it would change how much cash was in digits. And so in the current QE thing, which is a whole different subject in a way, so that's another subject we'll get to. So in this process itself is not insidious, because of this key component of collateral. So then all these deposits are claims on the deeds that are the collateral for the loans. So if the person doesn't pay back the loans or can't pay them back, the depositors have essentially a claim on the deeds of actual value. And so that works out okay-ish. The trick is what gets called a deed or what gets called collateral. So what can happen in the system, let's go down here to a new system, is that different stuff can end up having deeds. And so now we have deeds for like stocks and bonds, which are claims of value. So now we have claims, not real value. So a stock, just go ahead and put the whole word. So a stocks and bonds and other pieces of paper, any IOU that has any kind of recognized value, a bank might consider that collateral. So theoretically, you could go to the bank and say, I have $1 million in stocks, so we have $1 million in stocks for IBM. And the bank could say, well, that's good collateral. And so if I used that in the bank might be willing to give me, say, $700,000 back. So it's taken in $1 million worth of value in that it will own it if the person doesn't pay the loan. The loanee has got $700,000 of cash now. It still owns its original thing. It's just paying interest on renting its value. And now theoretically it could buy more stock with that money, put that $700,000 of stock in, and get, say, another $500,000 of value out, buy more stock. So you could see that a single $1 million investment or a single deed to a house could go in first. Maybe you put in a $1.2 million house as a deed in, and then you pull $1 million of loan money out. So the bank feels secure because it's got $1.2 million of collateral. It thinks it's doing okay here, and it's only giving out $1 million, so it seems a safe loan, and it'll collect rent on these loans. Now the trick is these loan rates, depending on the banker this individual can find, might be only 5% or 3%, just kind of depends on interest rates. And so interest rates are really low right now, and so this is really profitable to do if you can get the money. Google did this. Google has all the money in the world, and yet Google borrowed money. And it did so because it could get it really cheap and buy more of its own stock or whatever else it wanted to buy, some other company. So it can be very profitable to create this leverage out of this system. So now, instead of just owning $1 million worth of stock, this individual could own, by even just going this far, but let's just say in the end it could own $3 million. So it could put $1 million of value and get $3 million of ownership. And if the stock price is going up 10% a year, they're obviously making a profit on each one of these loans. They're making 5% over what they're paying on it. So, this can be a fairly profitable racket in terms of extending their equity. So instead of just making 10% a year, they can increase that to 15% or 20% based on use of this leverage they've created. But the problem is that all of this is uncollateralized in the sense that the stock crashes or goes to zero. None of this money can be paid back because all this person's equity is in stock, and so they'll have no value to pay the loans back. And if they don't have some sort of real value at the core of it, then it's even more, like some of it won't matter because they'll be owing money to themselves essentially. These are their own deposits versus their own withdrawals, so it'll all even out. But you can see that if everybody's doing something like this, even if you're only losing 0.2% of value on each one of these transactions, a lot of 2% add up, and you'll end up with, much higher numbers of bad collateral. Alright, so that's another scheme. And the bottom line is all the profit made off of this stuff is, capital gains income, which is only taxed at 15%. So it's taxed less. So this addition to somebody's stuff pile or their surplus pile, this added value of cash, gives them the ability, the profit cash, gives them the ability to buy more assets, and gives them in turn the ability to deposit more assets or monetize more assets and create more value creation. So this is how essentially the rich get richer, and then richer, and then richer, and then richer, and they get more and more money, and then they outbid everybody else for the value of stuff, and then nobody owns anything anymore, they just rent it. And I guess I'm sort of arguing that we're already there, and we're substantially there. So the big difference too, so the next part of this bad system is really probably the most insidious part, is the uncollateral loans. So there's not a lot of personal uncollateralized loans, but there are a lot of business uncollateralized loans. It's probably at least a quarter of the loans outstanding. It might be even more. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to get those kind of numbers. So, $4 or $5 trillion of liabilities on deposits that, have no collateral. So the money, once those digits are lost, those digits will never be made back. But anyway, the real big one is the government, because when the government borrows, it doesn't do any of this, put a deed into the bank and get the cash out. It just takes cash in on a piece of paper, and the piece of paper is a claim on stuff the government doesn't have. It's basically a stuff on tax revenues. Okay, so which is a claim on we the people's income, essentially, all of our incomes. So if our incomes, let's say you have a recession, incomes are going down, and then the stock market starts going down, then revenues will go down, and you won't be able to get any money selling bonds because no one will have the money to buy them. And you can see that this is the spiral, and it's just whether or not this spiral catches ground and starts going the other way again, or whether the spiral just keeps going deeper and deeper and deeper because there's no way to stop it. So that's sort of the argument, is when does something precipitous happen, where, I mean, a key component would be yes, as soon as the government has to start printing cash to pay bills. So if tax revenues drop far enough and the government can't sell a bond, so it can't borrow money from the rich, because the rich would demand, because they know inflation's in the air, so they wouldn't lend you money unless you offer them 10 or 20% interest, which would be impossible to pay. And if interest rates ever went that high, the government wouldn't be able to finance the debt because it owes so much money. The interest payments would consume all the tax revenues. So as interest rates go up, obviously a bigger and bigger piece of tax revenues are going to be eaten up on just the interest you have to pay on the old debt. So I'm not doing this very precisely, but $17 trillion, let's say, is the debt, is a lot of money. It's more value than all the value. I've heard of numbers like all the value of the real estate west of the Mississippi. I mean, it's a huge amount of money, $7 trillion, a huge amount of stuff. And also remember the stock market, which is all a big part of this definition of wealth. You got to recognize the stock market can theoretically go down to almost like 1% of its value. So it can go down really far because it's just paper on assets that it's so overvalued. The company's actual worth outside of its income is a tiny fraction of stock prices. So theoretically, you know, the wealth of people on which we are collecting revenues and getting tax money could drop substantially. They can, you know, you can't get the value out of the stock market. So if the stock market was at 15,000, you know, which let's say represents $15 trillion worth of value, that value doesn't really exist, because theoretically, depending on how fast the market drops, you can't get the value out, because depending on how fast the stock prices drop, they can drop, you know, 50% or 70%, you know, in just one day, theoretically. You know, you could try to sell a stock and it just doesn't have any value. Nobody would want it. Nobody can buy it. No matter how low you go, it's just nobody has any extra money to buy it with, because everybody's losing their money in this, you know, from the stock market dropping. And so there's just no cash, no capacity. Nobody can sell their stocks because no one wants to buy their stocks, so they can't even buy stocks that are a bargain because nobody has any cash to buy stocks with. You know, in that circumstance, then there's no government revenues, but people are still in the hospital. People are still need to pay their rent. People still need their income if they're a government employee. People still need all kinds of things. So the government then has to start printing cash to pay bills, you know, all its obligations to, you know, keep the military running and keep the electricity on and keep all this stuff going for people. It'll start printing cash to do that, and that'll start creating a huge inflation, which will compensate for some of this, but some of it will make it even worse. So anyway, yeah, no matter what you do, it ends up still being complicated because there's tiers of systems built into this thing, and some problems are not really problems, like the Fed, and some problems are huge problems, like borrowed money. And people don't understand it, and insurance, FDIC insurance that doesn't have any hope of covering the liability. So where would the extra money come from? You know, $30 billion is not going to last very long, and you know, in a crisis. So where would the extra money come from? It has to come from government revenues, and if all the rich people are losing their money, where are you going to get the money from? Yeah, and then if the rich people are also losing their money, recognize also another key factor here, I guess I should have pointed out, is that we have a whole different kind of economy. We're not buying each other's labor anymore. It's like Joe isn't buying Jim's labor. Like Jim doesn't make something, sell it to Joe, and Joe makes something, sell it to Jim. No, it's Alphonse or something. Okay, some rich fuck is the one paying both Joe and Jim. So both Joe and Jim are making a living off of Alphonse's stock market money. And so when that stock market money dries up, or his taxes have to go way up to pay these bills and all these FDIC insurance and all this other crap, then all of a sudden Joe and Jim ain't going to have no jobs because they're not working for each other. They're working for this one rich guy. So that's why this whole economy, now that we've built it this way, it's totally service. It's totally dependent on the wealth coming from China, you know, the wealth of ownership of cheap labor. And so as soon as that dries up, you know, that stored wealth, that stock market wealth, our employment dries up. And then this whole thing just gets worse and worse. You know, more unemployment creates less revenue for businesses. Stocks go down more. Less stocks, less money, less work for Joe, less buying by Joe, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And if, like I said, if government has obligations, it must pay. I mean, it just can't avoid it. And if it can't raise taxes quickly enough, it's going to have to print cash. And if it starts printing cash, that'll create inflation, and that inflation will just make life as a consumer, you know, people just won't be able to consume anything except the basic necessities of, you know, food and maybe some energy. And so the rest of the economy just dies, and unemployment just gets worse, and you're in the depression. And that's where we're heading. And such. Doesn't look like this is recording properly, but I'll find out. Maybe want to try using some different cameras and such and whatnot, and so forth. Yeah, try the HD thing sometime. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Record or not, it's I've recorded it, so we'll see. It's recorded in my brain.